We approach the term restorative practices in a way that's different than some. We distinguish between the terms restorative practices and restorative justice. And in public health terms, we see restorative justice as tertiary prevention, that is, responding to the problem and hoping to alleviate further occurrence of the problem. So if it's a disease or violence or whatever, that's the tertiary. But we've taken restorative practices to include restorative justice, how you respond to wrongdoing. But we've added the proactive and informal ways of building social capital in advance of wrongdoing as primary prevention, as a way that you actually reduce the occurrence of wrongdoing before it happens. And we've given some brief history of the restorative practices movement as we define it. In the modern context, we acknowledge the developments in the 70s, Mark Yahtzee, a probation officer up in Canada, having some of the first, creating some of the first encounters between between victims and offenders. He was a probation officer. And also some of the realization as that happened that it also had its roots in ancient indigenous Aboriginal practices. So in effect, what he did echoed the past. And in our specific sense, I first started thinking about the term restorative practices or restorative justice, although we were actually doing it, and as with many people who encounter it, they say, oh, I've been doing that already. Well, okay, but to give it a specific vocabulary and way of talking about it, I met an Australian police officer, Terry O'Connell's here with us, in 1994, where he'd been using a variation of what he understood of family group conferencing in New Zealand. And in both cases, those two restorative models sprung up during the 90s and added a whole dimension to the idea of restorative justice. Our own efforts grew out of the IRP, grew out of Community Service Foundation and Bucksmont Academy, which since 1977 have been working with young people who are either at risk or adjudicated delinquent in hopes of changing their behavior. And we found that many of the things we were doing really already anticipated what we're all now calling restorative practices. And in addition to the history, we have a supporting framework. And this has been really important as a way of giving more substance, because we really have not just a specific strategy. It's not just one thing you do in restorative, but we do a whole variety of things. And people can have things that they do that they go, to be concrete, solution-focused brief therapy, for example, is very engaging, is doing things with people rather than to them or for them, meeting our fundamental premise. But we needed some other more specific vocabulary and ways of looking at it. And we really like things with 3 and 4 elements whenever possible. My eyes glaze over when I try to remember 12. So this is a familiar window to many of you, or perhaps all of you, but it was developed very collaboratively as a way of saying we're in the with box. We call it restorative, or you can call it authoritative, but it is about a balance of support and control or limit setting. And it's been really, I think, a very helpful way of defining restorative. Paul McColl developed a restorative justice typology, a way of looking at when things are partly restorative, mostly restorative, or fully restorative, and where you have an overlap of both victims, communities of care, and offenders. That's the highest level of restorative, and it's been a very useful way to look at that. The restorative practice continuum starts with either of the formal conferences or other formal processes, but it then takes what happens in those events and identifies them as we use them in everyday life. So the affective statement, just a way of expressing feelings, and the affective questions, which get people to express their feelings, and then the use of these in small impromptu conferences, groups, or circles has been a really useful way to define things. The 9 affects, starting with the many ways we experience negative feelings, the neutral, surprise, startle, and the positive affects. Another really useful way, which we learned from Don Nathanson and his mentor, Sylvan Tompkins, and Nathanson's own concept of compass of shame has been really helpful as a way of understanding what goes on with restorative processes and with people when they're dealing with adversity and difficulties and problems. Fair process coming out of the Harvard Business Review, a classic article which deals with the concept of what makes people think they're being treated fairly, and that really has proved to be integral to understanding restorative practices: engagement, explanation, and expectation clarity. And then we've identified what we think are the most generic ways of looking at restorative processes. So the restorative conference, circles, the 2 names for what was originally the family group conference in New Zealand and North America, family group decision making, and then a whole variety of informal practices. But we recognize there are lots of other things on that continuum: peer mediation, victim offender mediation, all of those things. But we've identified those for our purposes that we feel are the most generic, the most widely put to use, and then people do variations on them, and we acknowledge that as well. In effect, for example, with the formal conferences, we're not saying you have to do it our way. We like the Real Justice script, but for example, Tim Chapman in Northern Ireland and Ulster is using a similar approach, but they don't actually use a script. They encourage people to tell their stories, and we don't want to quibble with that. What we're saying is if you get people in a safe place to have a real conversation with each other, you've achieved the restorative goals. But we set out what we think are the ideal, just to give some reference points.